Hello and welcome to the third episode of the yet to be named cabinet series. So at the end of the previous week I got one edge of the laminations straight and square and then ripped it just over width on the bandsaw. That way I could then put them through the drum sander as I am here, and that would get rid of all the saw marks and make them parallel to the planed face. Also, while I've got time, those of you on mobile devices watching this video can now access the social media links in the top right of the page via the description of the video, because it came to my attention that doesn't actually work like I thought it would. So this rather beautiful looking jig was made to cut the joins at the top and bottoms of the cabinet where the laminations join together, and it's run through the table saw as seen here. So you can see me setting the stop there just to give me something to butt the jig up against, and then very carefully I run it through the saw, being careful not to absolutely obliterate the whole thing. Moment of truth. There's the result. So then once I had that joint cut, I could pop it on my full-size drawing, follow it round, and then mark off the midpoint of the cabinet on that bit of material there. So there's the knife line, and then I could just slowly trim back to that on the table saw. So I did this with both sides of the carcass, getting it as close as possible to my drawing, and then took it over to my workbench afterwards and just trued up any small discrepancies with the plane. And then using a band clamp I could just knock together a quick dry fit of the cabinet and make any tweaks where necessary. And then once the gaps close up nicely, I could start thinking about the grooves for the back panel in the cabinet. So here you can see the ring fence above and below the cutter. Now the cutter is protruding about 6mm out from the fence, so that means that when I run the workpiece up against the fence it cuts 6mm deep. And that rather beautiful sound there was the sound of Andy and Sophie breaking the drum sander. But that is how you cut a groove in a curved component using the ring fence. So with the groove now cut, I could start thinking about veneering the back panel. That'd save me a bit of money and be resourceful and all those other things. So I decided to use some offcuts from the laminations of the carcass. So I just had to cut these back down to a parallel width. Flush trim one edge of the pack to make jointing easier later on, and then just plane out any small lumps and bumps left over from the router cutter. And now I could start laying out the Footmatch pattern. So I labelled each of the leaves on the bottom left corner, because I always forget to do this and then get the pack mixed up and have a right old nightmare getting it back together. But it's just orientating them and flipping them in a certain order to create a mirror effect. And then to take up the little bit of width left over, I just used 2 extra offcuts. And then the rather laborious task of taping it all together commenced, followed by cutting it all to the length of the panel. So to do this I used the Gramercy Tools veneer saw with a wooden fence. So the saw just has a flat edge on the back, knife edge teeth, and it just slowly cuts through the veneer. It doesn't work too well on constructional, but it's quite satisfying breaking it off at the end. It's like snapping a poppadom. Quite a stale poppadom. So after it was all cut to width and length, it was ready to be popped in the veneer press. So I very carefully applied the cascamite to the workpiece. Spread it about a bit, making sure to get to all the corners. And then with a little aid from Zach and Jack, we could just pop all the panels in, including packers over all the pistons, just to stop the veneer press buckling under its own pressure. And then while the bed's getting raised, everyone takes the opportunity to video bomb it. First of all Zach, and then Tim. Followed by some incredibly sexy dancing. You normally have to pay for that. So this process was particularly stressful. Using the jig that I used on the table saw, I could actually use it to joint the two components together as well. So for this I used the Faithfull domino, using the base of the machine rather than the fold down bed. And to start with, I just took a little nibble out so I could measure down from the inside face, because that's the face I wanted to be flush. And then once I was happy, I could take a full depth pass. Then I popped all the dominoes in the sockets. And then just prayed that it actually went together first time. Which it did. So to make it a little bit easier on myself later on, I decided to sand the insides before gluing it up. So here I'm just making a curved sanding block that matches the inside radius of the cabinet. And then just wrap some sandpaper around it and got to work. So I started at 120 grit, worked through to 180 and then polished it off with 240. And then I could also use the same block to sand out any small steps that were on the inside join, because the dominoes weren't quite in the right place, as in maybe about 1/2 millimetre out. I could just sand it back 1/2 millimetre and make both those components meet perfectly in the middle. And this took, I'd say, a good part of 2 hours. I became incredibly fussy with it. But the joint at the end was well worth the effort. Closed up absolutely beautifully. No steps whatsoever. So I cold pressed the veneer overnight. Now the press hadn't quite cooled down on one side than the other, so it actually, you can see there, it caused the panel to bow a bit. But it's not too much of an issue, because once it's in the groove it just pulls itself flat anyway. Next was the disgusting job of getting the veneer tape off. And then using the Bosch GEX 150, I sanded the panel down with 120 grit. Stopped it with my hand, which probably isn't the best thing, but it's quite fun. And then 180 grit. And then just finished it up by sanding with the grain with 240 grit. So this bit's incredibly hard to explain, but basically I needed to make an offset block to trace around my template in order to be able to cut the panel to the correct depth of the groove. It should make a bit more sense in a minute, just bear with me. So because the depth of the groove is 6mm, I drilled this hole to accept the pencil that's going to be in there, 6mm away from the radius on that block. And then I lined up the carcass with where I wanted the veneer to show on the back panel. Popped the template in there. And then traced around that with the offset block. And that would give me the overall size of the back panel, including the depth of the groove. And there you can see the offset around the template. So I then cut that as close as possible to the line. And then just finished it off on the disc sander. Now you can see here that it hasn't quite bottomed out in the groove, it's poking up about 1mm. So to fix that I just set my marking gauge to 1mm, scored a line round both of the radiuses and then sanded back to that line. And then at last the main part of the carcass was done. And with that, that wraps up the third week of the construction of the cabinet. Thank you again very much for watching. And as I said at the start of the video, those of you on mobile devices, iPads, tablets, whatever it is, you can go to the description of the video and view the social media links that way. And for those of you on desktops who are able to click on the icons, little word of warning, first of all it will redirect you to my website, and then you can click on the icon which will redirect you to the relevant social media account. But a follow on either or all of those would be very much appreciated. But again, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next week.